I'm here today with John Kay, a fellow of St. John's College at Oxford University and a visiting professor at London School of Economics. We're here to discuss his book, Other People's Money, The Real Business of Finance. It's published by Public Affairs Press. Welcome, John.
Good to be here, Rob.
This book feels to me like the delayed answer to what happened in 2008. It takes a bit of time to sort things out and reflect on things, but it's not cautious, it's not marginal. It's a bold statement about what finance represents in our society and how it needs to change.
I hope that's right. And we've had a lot of books in the last 5 years about what went wrong in 2008, and particularly narrative descriptions of the events of the crisis and that led up to it. What I'm arguing here is wanting to take a much longer look and say that what we saw in 2008 was not a kind of once-in-a-lifetime event. It was rather the culmination of a process of financialization that had affected the whole structure of the economies of the West over 20, 30 years. And that's a development that is by no means over yet. And it's gone deep into the heart of the way not just our financial sector operates, but the way our business operates as well.
Yes. So we're not talking about a few bad apples and a wave of hubris, though that was involved. We're talking about a deeper structural critique about the very nature of finance.
That is right. There were a few bad apples, of course, but in the main, people are responding to the environment in which with which they're faced. And if people behave badly on a large scale, and they did, then it's not so much their fault as the fault of the systems that produced that behavior. And that's the issue we need to address.
So when you start, how would you say, like a detective, looking for the clues of what went wrong structurally, how would you characterize what you found? What was the transformation of finance that is at the core of which say the vulnerabilities that were?
Yes, I began by saying that, when I was at school in Edinburgh, way back in the 1960s, going into banking, joining the Bank of Scotland or the Royal Bank of Scotland, was something that you did if you didn't get quite good enough grades to go to a good university. And if you worked hard for 20 years, you would become a manager and you'd be a figure in the local community and you'd know the people whose money you were handling and whether people were worth lending to or not. All that got swept away, and we attracted much cleverer people into these businesses, so that by the time these banks, the Royal Bank of Scotland and the Bank of Scotland, both went bust in 2008 and had to be rescued by the British government. And by that time, they were run by very smart people with Harvard MBAs and good degrees from the best universities. They were cleverer people, but they weren't clever enough to handle the complexities of the environment which had been created around them. And that's the key issue, that the problems are not a few bad apples or a few people with hubris. The problems are in a system that evolved in a dysfunctional way and gave opportunities for people to exercise that hubris and didn't impose enough effective restraint on the bad apples.
What kind of incentives inside the machine and inside a banking or financial institution emerged that led to this kind of rapid growth?
Part of the problem with finance is that as we've moved from a world centered around relationships, the world I was describing of the kind of old-fashioned bank manager and stockbroker, to a world that is centered around anonymous transactions and trading, you create an enormous bias to action. Almost everyone in the financial sector now gets rewarded for doing something. Mm-hmm. You don't get paid for waiting to see what happens. Mm-hmm. You don't get paid for patience. So the result of that is that we have a massive activity going on and incentives to create activity. And much of that activity is of little or no value to the real purposes of financial services.
And what you see inside the firm about, how do you say, who becomes the priority. The old relationship bankers were considered dinosaurs, and the new traders rose to the top management. And if you study, I know people at business schools and others have studied the structure of top management, the traders essentially took over.
That's right, and we saw it very clearly in Britain, where we had a fairly sudden deregulation in 1986. What happened was that the retail banks, because they had huge capital resources, acquired other financial services firms. The retail bankers, it turned out, didn't know how to run these firms, and the culture clash was very severe. These mergers didn't work, but these firms remained conglomerates, and what happened was the traders, who were greedier and smarter, eventually took control of the whole enterprise. Now, part of the problem we have here is that the culture that is appropriate to retail banking, which is cautious, necessarily bureaucratic to some degree, which relies on processing millions of transactions every day with a very high degree of accuracy, is really very difficult to reconcile with the culture of the buccaneering culture of the trading room. And actually what happened in the end was that the culture of retail banking was corrupted by the culture of trading. People were finding they were on sales targets, trying to generate activity, regardless of the underlying needs of their customers.
And when you look at these internal structures and how things modified, what happened in the realm of compensation? What were they saying to themselves inside? Who got paid for doing what?
Well, compensation went through the roof. And now part of what happened there was traditionally the risk-taking entities, the investment banking and market-making sides of finance, had been conducted in partnerships. And in partnerships, the people who are running the business bear the losses as well, a share of the losses, as well as the share of the profits. That meant they typically made quite a lot of money, but it was very volatile what they made. And if things went wrong, which they occasionally did, they did very badly indeed. And that, of course, meant the people in these organizations monitored what their colleagues were doing pretty closely, because their money was on the line. In the 1980s, most of these organizations changed to public companies. And once you have a limited liability company, that means you can take the upside, but you don't share the downside in the same way. And of course, the transition to a public company didn't affect the remuneration expectations of the people who were at the top of these organizations.
Yes, yes. So that you have a situation where within society, the top 1% was increasingly populated by financiers. But even within these firms, the proportion of compensation that went to the very top management was concentrated as well.
Yes, so I was staggered by the observation that the share of the top 1% in income in the economy generally, in Britain and the United States, has increased very sharply since the 1970s with the rise of financializations. Whereas the first approximation, it's doubled from about 8% to about 15%. But when I looked at the structure of compensation in Barclays Bank, I discovered that the top 1% of employees there were taking something over 40% of the total remuneration of the bank. And there were a small number of people earning astronomical salaries. And actually, although popular opinion hates bankers at the moment, the vast majority of people who work in banking are not being paid particularly well at all.
Well, they get co-branded with the superstars.
They get co-branded, but they're actually
but
doing
they don't get paid.
the fairly mundane clerical tasks that make sure we get our salaries on time and are able to pay our bills.
And in the United States, in the data that I've seen, in addition to this, say, flooding of the top 1% and the increase of the compensation of the top 1% or top 1/10 of 1%, we also saw non-financial corporate management in what is referred to in academic literature as the principal agent problem, where the management can't be disciplined by the collective of stockholders, And they work with financiers to extract more wealth through stock options and stock buybacks and the whole philosophy. I believe Michael Jensen was really the backbone of shareholder value.
There were two or three things happening there. One was that as the financial sector and the top management of the non-financial sector became closer, people running real non-financial businesses started asking, hey, why am I not getting paid anything like as much as these guys, especially since I'm generating a fair proportion of their business. Secondly, the whole rhetoric of shareholder value and the idea that one should link managers' compensation to share prices, especially in an era when share prices were mostly going up, legitimized the explosion of executive remuneration. And third, I think there was a kind of cultural shift of when asked why did people who were running big companies back in the 1970s not pay themselves very large amounts of money. There weren't, as it were, any formal restraints that stopped them. It was just that wasn't how you behaved, and that
Robert
changed.
McNamara, famously as the head of Ford Motor Company, was paid about 14 times what the average worker made at Ford Motor Company about 1963. And they asked him once, why aren't you paid more? And he said, oh, that would be shameful.
Yeah.
You don't hear that from top management.
And actually, Robert McNamara may not have made a great defense secretary, but he was pretty good at running Ford.
That's right, that's right. So now comes the question. You've identified all of these things happening within the industry, but this industry is embedded within society. And in two respects, I'm very concerned. One relates to we offer an awful lot of safety net and an awful lot of support to the financial industry on the grounds that that industry facilitates growth and productivity in our society. Is that a fair assessment, or is this also a mythological construct?
We have this idea that finance is special. And actually, every industry I've ever talked to believes it's special. But finance is exceptional in the kind of strength of that conviction.
Is it because of the harm they can do in the event of a collapse, as shown by 2008 or 1932? Or
it could be, but we have this idea that collapse in the financial sector is inevitable. Actually, if I look at Britain, we did pretty well in avoiding bank collapses right throughout the 20th century. In the United States, which had a very fragmented banking system, suffered very badly in the Great Depression.
Right.
The British banking system, which was more focused and concentrated, did not in the same way. I think up to the 1970s, we'd actually learnt quite a good deal about how to handle these things. But the finance sector goes on thinking of itself as special. It talks to itself. It has its own language. Most people outside the industry don't speak that language, don't really understand what it does. And we're clearly scared that it might collapse and take large parts of our social and business lives with it. But actually, the same is true of the electricity network, the telecoms network, the water the water supply, and so on. And we've managed to manage these things pretty well. They're in fact run by fairly ordinary engineers who attach a very high priority to the robustness and the resilience of the system. One thing I do in the book is I say, don't we have quite a lot to learn from how these complex systems in other parts of the economy operate? And I think we do. And this is one of the parts of saying, finance isn't special. We should look at finance in the same way as we do other sectors of the economy. We should ask, what are the goods and services we want it to deliver? How well is it delivering them? And we should also say that if these activities can't support themselves without subsidies or guarantees or other support from governments, then perhaps they shouldn't be happening.
Yeah. Well, the demystification of finance, I think, can take on two forms. We might call decoding the rhetoric, but also looking again at structure. What kind of benefits to productivity do we see? I know Adair Turner, the chairman of INET's governing board, has also written a book recently, and he talks about how collateralized commercial and residential real estate has an awful lot to do with what the sector has done, and things that produce, which you might call the metaphor of the past, manufacturing productivity growth, are really not activities that this sector is deeply involved in any longer.
Yes, there are various things we ought to see there. One is to ask, what do we actually want the financial system to do? And that's a key question. And in my view, there are four things we want from the financial system. We want it to operate our payment system so we can receive wages and salaries, pay our bills, and businesses can manage their transactions. That's in some ways a relatively easy bit. It's what most of the people who are employed in the sector do, and it's the essential utility we all need, and if it broke down even for a few hours, we would all have problems. Second thing we want it to do is to help us manage our wealth over our lifetimes and between generations. Third thing is capital allocation. And I think not many people understand how capital allocation operates in a modern economy. First of all, the stock market isn't very important as a means of raising capital anymore. That businesses big enough to have stock exchange quotations now generate more than enough cash for their investment requirements from their own internal resources. And that's just as true of established capital-intensive companies like ExxonMobil as it is for modern companies like Apple, which actually has more cash in the bank than any company has ever had in the history of the world. And actually, most of what capital allocation is about in current economy is housing. In Britain, 60% of the capital stock of the country is houses, mostly owner-occupied. In the US, it's a bit less, but it's nearly 50%. It's a similar figure in France to the one in Britain. Germany is a bit more like the United States. Actually, housing finance is the most important part of the capital allocation mechanism. That used to be done pretty well, actually, in thrifts and small specialist institutions. And it's another example of these things where it was done in a more complicated way by cleverer people, and it turned out in the end that it was being done a lot worse than it had been in the old days, where you were interviewed by a local manager who looked you over, knew the area, knew the house, and was concerned about your ability to pay it back. And the final area is risk management. And what people say about we need the financial system to help us manage our risks. And that's a rather strange world, because if you talk to people in the financial sector, they will explain how we've become much more sophisticated in risk management over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, that's a bit odd, since first of all, we've had even bigger crashes when this has happened than we've had before. And that's again an example of the techniques have not improved enough to cope with the extra complexity of what has been created. But more interestingly still, the risks that people have focused on managing are the risks that have been created within the financial system itself.
Yes, we're not talking about acts of God or...
Yeah, that's right. And the risks that concern ordinary people are kind of Hurricane Katrina. It's getting it's illness, mortality, relationship breakdown, these things. These are the things we need the financial system to help us with. And these sure aren't what the people on Wall Street and the City of London are thinking about.
This is growing your own, your own calamities, endogenous risk.
And congratulating yourself on your limited success in diffusing them.
But let's go then. You have these breakdowns like 2008, and the pure free market fundamentalists suffer a little bit of egg on their face from such an episode. But some people would have said, okay, this calls for the government. But in the United States, after we saw the bailouts, the so-called TARP legislation, Troubled Asset Relief Program, and other things, the public actually turned on the government and said, you're an insurance agency for the rich and the powerful. You're not regulating for the public. You are enablers. Do we have a regulatory system now that is not up to the task, that is captured by the power of the financial sector and is incapable of the reforms that we need?
And the regulatory system we have is not up to the task. And there's almost everything wrong with it. I mean, it's extensive, it's intrusive, it's largely captured by industry interests, and it's ineffective in achieving the public interest objectives. And what we have is a system that now, the public has reacted to that by mostly saying what we need is more regulation. But we don't need more regulation of the kind that we've had. Indeed, regulation is in large part responsible for aggravating the problems we've had, because much of the complexity of the system has been generated by regulation and attempts to circumvent regulation.
Yes. Yes.
We have to think about it in a quite different way, because the truth is that this attempt to regulate an industry by writing very detailed rules from the centre does not work and has not worked anywhere it's been tried. The paradox is, if it would have worked, then the Soviet Union might have worked. And the Soviet Union didn't work because you couldn't run an economy by writing rules at the centre
Yes.
and telling people to follow them. What we have to do, and what you need to do in a market economy, is you focus your regulation on the structure of the industry and the incentives of the people who work in it. And that's what we need to do, and get away from all these tens of thousands of pages that are now being devoted to the implementation of Dodd-Frank, and to a rather depressing degree written by industry lobbyists.
Isn't there also a dimension here, what I'll call a moral or ethical dimension? I was very impacted when I read the concluding paragraphs of your book about, in the Depression, when all of this blew up in the 1929 to 32 period, we got to a place that was pretty much, how we say, on the cliff's edge of the end of democratic capitalism. And we came back from the brink, some bold leadership, how would I say, symbolized by Franklin Roosevelt in particular. But you say, we pulled back from that brink, but these are not games. These are not sports metaphors. This is really at the essence of the fabric and the capacity for people to trust and believe in and participate in a society. Can we go on playing these cat and mouse games with regulation and lobbying and financiers acting like, how would I say, people are the prey and they're the predator? I can't imagine how do we get out of this corner? And is it not as much moral or ethical? Does not a financier have to fear what will happen in the afterlife?
That's right. I mean, it's a striking contrast if we go back to the 1930s, where, as you described, capitalism really was on the brink, and it was actually luck and great leadership that saved capitalism from the Great Depression and from Hitler, actually.
Yeah.
And we have some of these challenges, and at least again, we have the challenge of, as it were, saving capitalism from itself. And we also have the problem that because the public anger has no kind of focus or outlet in democratic politics, we see how the many voters are attracted to lunatics of all kinds from the fringe of the political spectrum. You have your Donald Trump, we have our Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
They're completely different in terms of their rhetoric, but what they have in common is that they're saying the present system isn't meeting your needs, and that resonates.
Yeah, they rise on the tide of outrage.
Yeah, they rise on the tide of outrage.
Yes.
That's exactly right.
So,
And we need democratic politicians with the leadership qualities that an earlier generation had, who are willing to handle this.
yes. And we also, I think, need stewardship from private sector leaders. This mentality that I'm not responsible to anything other than shareholder return, something that Milton Friedman encouraged. Doesn't that put us into a very difficult place, particularly in a global environment where a financier managing a multinational company can arbitrage between governments to the pecuniary advantage, but contributing to the disrepair of society.
I think that's right in a broader sense. We need to understand that the large corporation is a social institution which can only operate by being embedded in the society in which it operates. And its legitimacy is ultimately going to be judged and should be judged by what it contributes to the society in which it operates. We have made a mistake pursuing this mantra of shareholder value. And more than that, the mantra of shareholder value has legitimated to an excessive extent the enrichment of the extent to which these corporations are actually run for the benefit of their senior management. And the financial sector is actually the one in which this has gone furthest. It wasn't bank shareholders who did well out of the expansion of the financial sector. In fact, they were screwed like the rest of the population when things collapsed in 2008. It was the people who had made a lot of money in the years that ran up to it in remuneration and bonuses and options and didn't have to pay it back.
Yeah, the smart aleck saying in those days was IBG, UBG.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll be gone, you'll be gone by the time they clean up the mess we've made.
Right, which is why I have a chapter on the mechanisms of I'll be gone, you'll be gone.
Well, from my perspective, this is one of the most challenging books to the whole perspective and what you might call justification for finance in this modern era that we've been living through. And I'm very grateful that you've, what you might say, penetrated this logic and explored things with such vigor. And it's my hope that many, many people will read this and, to use your opening parable, that the ox will not die.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.